Hello, I'm Diane Arthur, the Communications Director for the City of Peoria. Earlier this summer, the city hosted a webinar to talk with you about the feasibility of adding an airpark to Peoria. City leaders and expert partners were there to answer your questions. Well, they're back here today to discuss why the city is exploring an airpark, dig a little deeper into the economic impacts, and then answer questions that you sent us in advance of the show. We had over 60 submissions from the public. Many of those questions were the same, and some were just comments. But rest assured, all of your comments and questions were shared and reviewed by city staff. So if you could please welcome today Assistant City Manager Rick Buss, Deputy City Manager Mike Faust, Jim Rounds, a CEO of Rounds Consulting Group, and Matt Quick, a partner with Kaufman Associates. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here and spending your time with us today on this important topic. Rick, we're going to get started with you. Pretty easy question, and one that we've heard often. Why are we exploring the need for an airpark in Peoria?
Yeah, I think the question and the answer is very, very simple. It's all about economic development. So economic development, why do we have economic development? To drive revenues for other services and amenities throughout the city. So a lot of the great amenities and services we have in Peoria, we need to continue to build on that as a city grows. So the airpark represents a massive economic opportunity, and we're just in the midst of the process of evaluating that opportunity.
Great. Mike, what's the area in particular that we're looking at for this proposed project?
That's a question we get frequently. Most specifically, the area currently being evaluated is in North Peoria, located virtually around Lake Pleasant Parkway and State Route 74. There's an old glider park that's out that way. That is the most predominant area being researched at this moment in time.
Great, thank you. So there's a lot of air parks around in the valley, of course. Deer Valley, we hear Goodyear, Glendale. With those already existing, why would Peoria be exploring this option? Are there partnership opportunities for us to explore with these existing airports? Rick, do you have some comments there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've looked at those before, but when we started off looking at this opportunity, it was really about what is the economic drivers here. And you'll hear us talk a lot about Scottsdale Airpark because it's an air park, it's a corporate air park that drives revenues. You'll hear inside the fence and outside the fence. The outside of the fence is where the real money is driven. Other things like Goodyear and Glendale really don't have that same dynamic, that same economic engine generator. Deer Valley, they're at capacity. And so although the City of Phoenix is at the table and we're talking to them, they own Deer Valley, we also talk to them about, hey, they're at capacity and they know it. So I know that Matt has talked a bit about demands of the other airports. There's just not room at other ones as well.
Right. No, I think you bring up some good points. And it's a good question, too, because when we talk about those airports that Diane mentioned, I mean, proximity is certainly something that comes into play. So if you want to talk at it from that perspective, you can think of Mesa Falcon Field Airport in proximity to Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport. I know those are two airports that serve a little bit different demand and capacity, but they still have a lot of general aviation activity, which we'll talk more about here in a little bit. And even more closer, you'd mentioned Glendale and Goodyear. I mean, those two airports are less than 10 miles apart. And really back to what Rick was saying, it's really about demand and feasibility. And one of the earlier studies that were conducted was the feasibility study. And that's what we looked at was what is the feasibility of an airport in the area? And we look at the different criteria that the Federal Aviation Administration defines from that perspective. How many based aircraft can an airport accommodate once it's constructed? 10 is the threshold that we use for that. The forecast that we came up with as a part of the feasibility study, we looked at the possibility for over 80 aircraft to be based at that airport, just based upon the demand in the region. We also, the FAA looks at the criteria from the standpoint of just being able to meet demand in an area that may be void of being able to do so, or looking at other airports that are at least 30 miles away from the proposed area that you're looking at. The 30 nautical mile certainly doesn't come into play here because of all the airports in the area, but again, it comes back to demand and feasibility and just knowing what's happening in the area, the number of registered aircraft in the area, the types of demands and services that can be provided by that aviation component is very large in the Phoenix area. So those are certainly considerations that we took into play and getting a better understanding that yes, there is feasibility for aviation activity and for potential airport sites within the area.
And this isn't the first time Peoria's discussed the possibility of having an air park within city limits. Rick, I know you had some history back there.
Yeah, I think the first time that we looked at studies was back in 2000. Most recently was 2017 as part of a effort to attract Amazon HQ, and now 2024. But it makes sense for us to go back and do studies that are applicable to today. Different dynamics, different socioeconomic factors, different growth patterns, that type of thing. So it wouldn't make sense for us to go back and look at studies that are done in 2000 and try to apply them to today. So that's why we're doing this. And again, just we are in the midst of a long process in thoroughly evaluating this potential opportunity. And that way our council can be fully informed so they can make fully informed decisions.
Yeah, and one of the things that we know what type of aircraft would be supported at Airpark such as this and what wouldn't be. And Matt, that's something that you're very well versed in working through these studies.
Yeah, we looked at, during the feasibility study, that was certainly a component of the forecast, was not just the quantity of aircraft operations, but the type or the fleet mix. And that's very important and keys in terms of kind of having a better understanding of what the definition of an airport could be, the types of demands and services that it can accommodate. So I mentioned the word general aviation earlier on, and that's really what we're looking at for a proposed airport or Airpark site in Peoria. It's being able to accommodate those different levels of activity. General aviation is a wide range of activity, ranging from small single-engine piston aircraft that can seat 2 to 4 passengers plus a pilot, all the way up to medium and larger-sized corporate business jets. Depending on their configuration, anywhere from 6 or 8 passengers up to 15 passengers. It just depends. So we're not looking at scheduled commercial service or air cargo. I know those are things that have been talked about in the past, but Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport, those are certainly the commercial service hubs within the Phoenix area. So we're really looking at the general aviation component and being able to accommodate small single-engine piston aircraft up to those medium and large-sized business jets. Those are the focus of an airport or an airpark that could be accommodated in this area.
Great, that's good. That's good information to share. One of the other things too, Mike, in the webinar, and we've heard several times, people asking, is this going to be put to a ballot, a public vote of the people, should we move forward with an airpark? And then as a follow-up question to that, what's the public process for people to participate?
Thank you for that question. I think part of the public process is this forum here, receiving dozens of questions, engaging in various public forums, whether it's at the city council or, again, just having an active communication. I think one thing we want to highlight with today's communication is we need to do a better job of really talking about those decision points, and I'll touch on that in a second, but it's important to translate that there's no decisions imminent in this moment. We are being as transparent as we can and sharing information and facts that we learn along the way, and whether it's part of the Airpark study or whether it's part of the financial analysis and the logistics of what this could look like. But we are very early in the process. And two specific questions that we get is, number one is, who are those decision makers and how might those decisions present themselves? And there's really two big things to think of. One of them is the land use decision making, and that decision belongs to the city council. They make all the land use decisions. They take a recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and then they make a final decision. And that happens on small zoning cases all the way up to larger projects such as this. The second decision would be a budgetary one. And that budgetary one could arrive in one of two ways. It could arrive in a decision for the city to do some construction and funding, or it could arrive in a deal between the city and a third party to do that. But those are the courses of decision making. And both of those decisions belong with the city council, both land use, that is a delegated authority given to city councils, and budgetary decisions or ability to enter into an agreement, which is also delegated to the city council.
You said the magic word, budget. So now we're talking money, and that's where we bring Jim into the conversation. We have a lot of economic questions out there from our residents, and we'll start with the big one. What's the economic advantage of having an airpark in Peoria?
Well, I first want to qualify it with, you have to have the right economics and you have to have the right public policy to make it work. You can't just throw out an idea in any community and say, we're going to force it to work. Peoria has been growing at a rapid pace. We're looking at a lot of pent-up demand for higher wage jobs in the area. So the political economic development positioning of the city matches with the economic demand for something like an airpark with a business center around it. So you have the airport, but a lot of the economic activity that we calculated had to do with what was called outside the fence that Rick mentioned earlier. All the businesses that would tend to locate in an area. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of pent up demand. You're going to have a lot of higher wage businesses wanting to locate here. And so we ended up calculating, we actually did 12 different analyses. That's the most we've ever done for a single project. And the most conservative one had around 8,000 total jobs, about 4,000 jobs on site, another 4,000 jobs in surrounding areas, because when a new business comes into an area, that business spends money and it creates work for other people. The new workers that come into an area spend money, and that creates additional demand for additional jobs. So we have about 8,000 jobs at build out, and we have close to $10 million in city tax collections every year. But keep in mind, these are conservative numbers. When you have something like an Airpark in an area that is just so thirsty for this kind of economic development, you end up having additional projects that will piggyback on that beyond what a normal model will pick up. And between that and the fact that we went with very conservative numbers to be as responsible as possible, and to also acknowledge the fact that a lot was still being planned, the impacts could be as much as 50% higher than what we estimated. So while some people might see these $1 billion impact, the same as a Super Bowl happening here every year, as a large number, it's probably understated by quite a bit. So I'm very optimistic, but it's the right time, it's the right people planning it, and it's the right economy.
If we could just, Jim, to that point, you raise an interesting deal where some people might watch this and go, $1 billion is not a conservative number. But your analysis was really limited to just the 500-acre airport Airpark, not the broader 6,000 acres in the general area. Where when people read this study, how does that 500 acres then compare to the comparative airports, airparks that you evaluated that leads you to this conservative estimate?
We also have to acknowledge that a lot of the different airparks, airports are different. They have different configurations, so you'll see some of the smaller ones have a very high percentage of industrial focus. So Deer Valley, Glendale, I think it has much higher industrial. You have Scottsdale Airpark, which is very much overweighted in higher wage office, but has a lot of retail as well. This one would be somewhere in between. We still have an employment base. You're going to have some businesses related to specific aviation type activities. But then you're going to have other businesses that want to rely on the supply chain of the materials coming in and out of an area, or the labor that's available. And so you have this spark in an area of the community that is just ready to grow rapidly, but not just grow well. And one of the biggest problems that we had in the state back when we had that Great Recession after 2008 is, one, we weren't diverse enough in terms of the economy. But two, we didn't have our ducks in a row in terms of having the right tax policy, the right economic development policy. We had to pretty much redo the entire way the state thinks about economic development, and it turned things around. Peoria has already well positioned itself in many of these areas. So it's going to be easier for these higher value added businesses to be locating in this area, and the Airpark and then the area surrounding the Airpark is going to pay for the infrastructure and other things that are needed to have other businesses expand. So it's like an upward spiral if you're doing it right, and right now we're seeing the city planning this spot on.
So Jim, one of the things you talked about was the economic impact, but there was also job growth. That 8,000 new jobs was a figure that came out of the report. We had residents write into us asking, are Peoria residents given priority for any new job growth that comes in as a result of an Airpark?
In terms of priority, there's around half of the jobs would be at the businesses that are at the Airpark nearby. And then you'd have a lot of the spin-off businesses where it creates jobs for everybody. This benefits every resident. It benefits people that work in the restaurant industry. It benefits people that work in business support services, everywhere. So a lot of the local market jobs typically have labor that comes from very nearby. Now, there's going to be competition for some of the really high wage jobs at these areas, as you would normally expect. But because Peoria is also working on economic development programs that have to do with workforce training, education, all of the different things that matter in growing an economy, I think that Peoria is going to be very well positioned compared to a lot of other projects that we've done. I've probably done 500 economic impact studies in my life, and this is one where I feel like we understated the impact, probably more than we've done in the past, but we didn't capture all the additional dynamic pieces that are going along with it, which includes not formally prioritizing the Peoria residents, but the jobs are going to be there for the ones that are trained that want it. And so those that are participating with how the mayor and council and staff want to continue to educate those individuals that are on that early part of their career, they're going to have a taller ladder to climb over time. And that's what we want. We don't want somebody to just go into a job and then wait for an inflation-adjusted salary increase. We want people to be given a tall ladder when they start and then given an opportunity to climb as high as they can. So Peoria, for me, very much reminds me of the word opportunity.
Great, thank you. Mike, infrastructure cost, obviously, you got to pay for the stuff that needs to be built. Residents like myself, like you, who's paying the bill? Is it a tax that's going to be allocated on residents, or how are we paying for this?
That's a question we probably get more than any other question, which is, we hear about this growth, but how does it impact the people who already live here and what we've already contributed to the growth? And you'll hear folks on the development engineering side as well as the economic development side of the organization talk about growth paying for growth. And that's an important aspect here. Now, a few things to note. The capital improvement program, which is the city's forecast of projects over the next 10 years, has included many of these projects in this area. When I say area, specifically Lake Pleasant Parkway between the 303 and State Route 74, a lot of these projects have been on the books for an extended period of time, and now it's just about organizing those projects and marching them forward. I think the key thing there is, and the key question we get is, will there be a tax rate increase? Tax rate increases have to go to the voters. I think that's an important facet to understand, but nowhere in any of the project planning that we've done has that concept even been brought onto the table. So it's a mix of growth paying for growth, whether that's successful purchasers of the land contributing to that cost. There is road construction sales tax that's already on the books. You have Prop 400, which we voted on as Prop 479 extension in the fall. These are all vehicles that we've contemplated to really put in the main arterial roadway system, the underground utilities, water, wastewater treatment, and reclaimed water distribution throughout. So it's that mix of growth paying for growth, development impact fees, but nowhere in here has a tax rate increase been contemplated.
So let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure, but the actual Airpark itself. Rick, there's some funding considerations, two different aspects. If you could kind of talk about the two courses and where people might expect us to land.
I mean, this is a really great question. Something we get all the time. Okay, why are we spending all this money? That type of thing. So there's really kind of two avenues you can take. You can take what's called a NIPIAS route and a non-NIPIAS route. So NIPIAS is an acronym that stands for National Planning Integrated Airport System. Airport systems. I'm looking at, yeah, I'm looking at Matt for confirmation. So a good way to think of NIPIAS is something that's publicly owned or government owned. In that case, there's a certain pathway you would follow. Again, same set of studies, but 95% gets reimbursed to the city. So simple math, if you have $100 million out, you get 95% back. You're really only out $5 million. So I hear that a lot in the public about, it's like, why would we spend $150 million? Well, you're really not. If you go the NIPIAS route, you're getting 95% reimbursed. If you go the non-NIPIAS route, which would be a good way to think about, is privately held corporate Airpark. In that case, the private sector is paying all the bills. So the really two pathways there, Diane, is a 95% reimbursement or 100% being paid. So that's a great question, and hopefully this message gets out about what really is the city on the tab for.
And Diane, to expand on that, there's another way of looking at it too. So we're often presented questions from lawmakers. We work with Democrats and Republicans. I'm a senior fellow at the Goldwater Institute, but I do a lot of work with the school districts. We work across the aisle because we do analyses based on return on investment. So we brought that concept down to the Capitol when we started analyzing public policy. If we can design something that provides more tax revenue than it costs the taxpayers, it's like a business decision that a successful business would make. And so I'm hitting the 10-year anniversary of my business. I probably changed out the computers 4 or 5 times. I didn't view that as a loss of revenue. I viewed that as an investment to make more later. And so if we're bringing business principles into government, you want to be working on projects where you have a positive ROI on the taxpayer profile. And in this case, the project itself, because the infrastructure is going to be spread out among a lot of different potential projects that could be built, but the annual revenues, and again, the ones that we provided were conservative, are going to so much exceed the costs that will just go to the Airpark itself. It's going to generate extra revenue that will then support parks. It'll support other projects, road projects. It'll support other things in economic development. And what you wind up with is a situation where the project not only pays for itself, but it allows for the government to make decisions about having even more competitive tax policy or fees, or better services, or a combination of the two. So I don't view this as something that's costing money. I view this as something that's needed if residents would like to have a more robust economy.
So that kind of answers our next question that was submitted, was will the city lose money on this endeavor? And Mike, I know you can bring that a little bit more closer to what that means for residents and our particular elected officials.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions we get a lot is, well, what's it going to cost to construct? And then, you know, airports are often viewed as a loss leader within a community, right? And so I think that there's a very valid concern there. Jim highlighted, you know, eloquently that return on investment approach, and where we are in the investigation right now is what's going to cost to construct. Because when you think about that upfront capital cost in terms of construction, whether it's federally reimbursed through the FAA or it's privately held, it really gets down to what is that, how does that get baked into the operating costs over time to see if the math makes sense. And a lot of that starts as early back as the environmental studies and understanding how will we address the waterways that are there, how will we address the adjacent infrastructure, how will you address power line corridors, and cost to construct the airport, given those constraints, then either help or hinder the overall math equation. And from that, the one takeaway we've clearly gotten from City Council and city leadership is this cannot be a drain on the city, right? The task is to actually do something wise to create an economic engine and not create a significant burden. So for those that are concerned about going after a project or tackling a burden, that's why we're doing this level of homework. That's why, folks, we're not just rushing to an answer. We're trying to get to reasonable facts to provide to the council so they can make informed decisions on whether to proceed. And a lot of that goes in. Is it viable? Is there demand? Yes. Is it economically viable? Yes. Now as we move to the next evolution of where might it be? What would be the cost to construct? How do you get to the operations of an air park? And what does that mean on the broad scale? That's where we are now, is continuing to collect facts. So we can't speak to the recurring costs at this point. We're still collecting facts and providing information relative to not only the economic benefit, but then also the construction and what it means for capitalizing the project.
So what we hear often is, what's wrong with the status quo? Things are good here in Peoria. Why are we even looking at this? What's the benefit? And I've heard each of you speak to that, but it really is about new revenue generation to not only sustain today, but to grow and meet the needs into the future. So whoever wants to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, please.
I don't mind taking a stab at it real quick, and maybe Rick can add too, is we live in a great city. We have, I would say, the best city in the greater Phoenix area. And that has a cost. And I think it is important to know that we do not have, if you look at the sales tax dollars, which is how we fund the majority of our general fund services, per capita, we're one of the lowest in the entire Phoenix area. And so by default, one of a couple things has to happen in order to maintain where we are. You have to increase the tax rate. Well, we've heard very clearly from mayor and council that that's not an option on the table, right? You can reduce service level. The whole point is to increase the service level. So then the net answer there is to create more volume, right? So with a fixed tax rate and greater sales tax volume, we could bring additional general fund to the equation. That funds police officers, that funds fire stations, it funds firefighters, it funds parks, park operations. When we take on trail systems or open space from our master plan communities, those things require general fund dollars to support. And unless you're willing to cut services, which we're trying to promote positive services, right? Unless you're willing to increase tax rates, which we've been told we won't, then that really drives back to the key point of you have to drive revenue. And the way to drive revenue is through sound economic development policy and projects that create economic engines to bring additional revenues to the city.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we do know for sure is that we're going to grow. We're going to continue to grow. So being satisfied with the status quo does not enable us to meet the challenges of that growth. We need to thrive as well. And that's a choice. That's a policy decision. Are you happy with the status quo? Are you going to sit back and being overtaken by growth? Or are you going to be proactive and get ahead of it and make a decision for your city and your fellow citizens? We want this to thrive. And so economic development engines like a potential Airpark provide the means for us to provide all the things that Mike just talked about. And then, this kind of leads into this idea that like there's some sort of a trade-off here, because we hear that a lot too, Diane, is that there's a trade-off. Like if you do Airpark, then we won't be able to get a road, or we won't be able to it's actually exactly opposite. It's not, the Airpark is completely separate from all those other things we talked about. But if we're going to meet the growth, we have to have economic development to provide the revenues to meet that growth. Residential revenue alone will not provide it. We will always be on the losing scale of that. And the economist to my right of me, I'm sure, can add to that, but it just isn't enough. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, think about it in terms of if you're happy with something, it doesn't mean that it can't be better. And one of the problems with economic development, though, is that if you stick with the status quo, you don't stay at the current level. You actually fall behind because other communities are going to be advancing. And Peoria is so well positioned to be a leader in this region, even statewide right now. We'd be ashamed to lose out on that. But it is an economic engine, but it's also an engine for what people would typically want. If you have additional large-scale economic development projects that provide more revenue than it costs to bring them in, then you have more local amenities. It takes care of some of the retail leakage where you have to leave the area in order to go shopping or go to your favorite restaurant. You would like to have those locally. You also have more jobs that are here, which means your drive to work isn't taking you away from your family for an extra 45 minutes every day because you're driving down the street to another business location. And the extra revenue can be used for things like the state public safety, the road conditions in general. So if you like having a quality economic profile for your community, you like having lower taxes, you like to be able to get in the car and not stay in the car too long before you get to work, and you like this kind of being part of this growing community where Peoria is going to be one of the highlights of the greater Phoenix area. It already is, but it's going to become more so in a very short amount of time. You have to embrace these types of economic development projects. And I'm asked all the time, we work with every community. We're the economic advisor for the Arizona League of Cities and Towns, so we work with everybody. When I'm asked, where would you like to locate, or where would you recommend that we locate our business, I bring up Peoria as the #1 location every single time, not because we worked on an airport issue, not because we worked on anything else. It's because we're familiar with the community and we're that optimistic about how it's going to grow. We're very bullish, and this is coming from somebody that usually is very negative about communities, trying to get them to improve in certain areas. I think Peoria has the best staff in the entire state when it comes to comparing city to city right now. And I think that the future is going to be very robust, but we need the public support in order to get there.
Great. So, Mike, this is not the only economic development initiative that the city is working on. We get asked, are there other economic engines the city is exploring? I imagine you have more than one egg in that basket.
Oh, absolutely. And it is a great question because folks would say, well, why only an airport? And I think for us, it's more of an Airpark play than anything else, right? As Jim has articulated, there's a lot of investigation that's gone on into, what is the right mix of industrial versus office job versus retail revenue, because they each present very different plays. And as we've analyzed all the different Airparks that you'll read about in the report, you'll see very different asset mixes. And so you'll see a play and a discussion around key sectors. It's something Rick talks about all the time. How do you have those target markets you're going after? Around the Airpark is really around aerospace and defense, right? There's a real need. You hear a lot of activity in the semiconductor and microelectronics play around onshoring key products that have been outsourced over the last several decades. You see a significant shift and drive to draw more retail businesses in, all while thinking through objectively, what are the infrastructure implications? What are the cost implications? How will you sequence them? So where you might hear conversations in this where it sounds very pro-Airpark, what you're hearing is a very pro-economic development aspect and a very objective look at an airport and its catalyzing nature on an airpark. And so with that, there's a lot of things in play, because we know that the densities of people bring forth opportunities for things like hospitals, right? We don't have a hospital in North Peoria, we need one. And really the big data point that hospital operators look for is densities. And so how do we drive those things in our planning? So to that point, Diane, there's a lot of details in play with a lot of different markets, a lot of complementary nature, but very objective looks at how to queue them up, how to get the right things in play. And where it might sound like we're very optimistic on some, we're very, as a group, very analytical in the approach of how do you make wise decisions for the long run, not just short-term wins.
And we've been asked directly multiple times, will building an airpark take money away from building additional parks or other quality of life amenities that we love here in the city of Peoria?
So I'm going to answer this question directly. The answer is no. And we've answered this question a handful of times, and I think it's important to drive that back. And I'll hit specifically on that conversation around Paloma Park, where there's a fallacy out there that efforts to remove funding from that site. There's a great explanation in the budget workshop that was done about what really happened with that bond and how that flows. I'm not going to break that down too much, but I'll highlight just two things relative to this. There is still over 60 acres of net new park space planned over the next 7 to 8 years that's visible within the development impact fee, the infrastructure improvement plan, and the development fees that pay for them. So I think there's still a significant investment going on in special use parks and in neighborhood parks in the growing parts of the community. As Jim had highlighted earlier, it's really these tax revenues and these that generate from the economic development projects that fund the ability to not only construct net new amenities like parks, but also continue to operate them into the future.
So to that point, Jim, people talk about schools. How do schools benefit from an economic engine such as an airpark?
Well, overall, schools benefit from the sale of state trust land. The investment interest goes towards paying for that. But you also see property tax collections, and then some communities come up with unique ways of trying to direct some revenue towards a school system, and that's more on a smaller local scale basis. But overall, how you help the community is not just that direct linkage between the tax revenue that goes right to the school, but a healthier economy will generate more tax revenue in all different areas. It'll create other businesses that are paying property taxes. It'll create other incomes that will be directed towards education and economic development programs. So a growing economy, and not just growing, but growing well, which is what we're talking about, will generate revenue for those types of things. And from parks to the classroom to lots of other things that residents would like, the same things that they're concerned about losing are the things that are going to be supported even more so with this kind of economic development behind it.
What about property values?
Property values, this comes up with a lot of projects. Whenever you have this type of development, you typically have higher income individuals coming into an area. It creates demand for higher priced homes, and you generally see an increase, not a decrease, you see an increase in property value. So if you have an existing home, your property value is going to increase and your net wealth is going to be higher. But plus, everybody's going to be making more money. It's not just somebody that works in an air park. It's going to be the restaurant down the street, the small businesses that you frequent. It's going to be all of these different areas, and that's going to lift the economy as a whole.
Great. So Matt, we had a lot of questions come in about environmental impacts related to this type of a project. What would it mean in particular for groundwater and the impacts to native wildlife?
Good questions, and I think we've kind of hit on this already. We're still in that exploratory phase. I don't really have an answer, just in full transparency. I don't have an answer to the environmental impacts, but we know that those studies would be coming. Any type of project to, any improvement on an airport, let alone a new airport, is going to require some significant environmental due diligence and documentation. Rick hit earlier on the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, or the NIPIAS versus the non-NIPIAS route. And there are different avenues to take from an environmental perspective when you look at how this facility would be funded. But at the end of the day, in talking with city personnel, we understand that there's a very significant amount of due diligence needed on the environmental side. So that would all be taken care of through the course of the study process. The feasibility study, the site selection study doesn't really get into that per se. But whether it's an environmental assessment, an environmental impact statement, regardless of the federal or state nature of looking at, helping to fund this airport in the future, there's going to be significant studies related to natural resources, biological and cultural surveys, phase 1 site assessments, jurisdictional wetland delineations. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. I know I'm getting really technical in talking about that, but a lot of those are to come in terms of the study process, and we understand the significance and the importance of that. I don't have answers right now as to how it could impact water or how it could impact wildlife, but with an understanding that those types of studies certainly will be forthcoming in terms of how the project's funded moving forward.
So along those lines, probably similar when we talk about potential noise impacts or mitigation, correct?
Right, yeah, those all fall in line with the environmental processes and resources that were looked at. So, and noise is obviously a very important factor for an airport. And I think it's, when people want to know what the impacts of noise are or what areas are going to be impacted more so than others, the easy answer is, those areas closest to the airport are going to be the most impacted from a noise perspective. And that can be the case, but, you also need to look at where that particular site is, the runway alignment, the fleet mix of aircraft activity that's going to take place. Again, all items that are to come, so to speak, in terms of being able to get a better understanding of the site. But we understand that those noise impacts are important. When you look at it from a Federal Aviation Administration or an FAA perspective, they have what they consider to be significant thresholds of noise. And again, a lot of the factors that go into the types of aircraft, the number of annual aircraft operations factor into that. So, we would be looking at that from the standpoint of what are those significant thresholds of noise, what are those incompatible land uses, if you will, residential, parks, churches, hospitals, things such as that, making sure that those would not be impacted from those particular significant thresholds. I can tell you the sites that we're looking at right now, or kind of the general area, I should say, there's residential in proximity, but it's a few miles away, to my understanding. So, a lot of that significant level of threshold probably wouldn't be met from the standpoint of incompatible land uses, but we understand that there's still a lot of study to be done for that in order to get a better understanding of those noise impacts moving forward.
And on that, the economics and the environmental issues can coexist as well. And so we did some research with the Nature Conservancy that reached out to us, and we found that historically Arizona was a little bit below average in terms of green jobs comparing to the U.S. in terms of ratio of jobs in green industries versus the U.S., the ratio of jobs in green industries. And we calculated if Arizona just caught up with the U.S. average, the state would have an extra $500 million in tax revenue every year to be spending on other projects. Well, one of the biggest areas where we could be developing is we need to get more involved in manufacturing the goods that are going to be used to help with environmental and climate issues, not just in Arizona or across the country, but across the globe. We have to be doing the R&D. This climate technology industry is going to be new, and it's going to be locating in areas like Peoria and others that are going to be thinking about these types of topics. It's going to be located in areas that are high tech, just like we're going to see more higher R&D related healthcare in the area longer term. And so you can actually have growth in economics and kind of be a leader in terms of how you look at mitigating some of the climate issues that so many people are concerned about. And this is going to be an area that's just going to present itself naturally. And it's an area that Peoria can later focus on once a lot of these other details are worked out. But I firmly believe we can be working on both. It gets back to that binary question from earlier is, are we choosing between A and B? It's like, no, we're choosing A and B, and A can also support B. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg on how Peoria is going to be able to grow longer term.
You know, very early in this process, and just to go back, because it was a specific question dealing with air traffic and runway selection. Still too premature to get into those details, correct?
It is. I mean, this speaks to the airspace question, and I know that several questions were submitted on airspace. Noise falls right in line with that. I think the perspective that we're looking at from a site selection standpoint is what is happening in the area. We understand that the entire Phoenix metropolitan area sits underneath a fairly complex airspace structure. With Phoenix Sky Harbor, obviously, you've got all the reliever airports that I mentioned earlier on. You have Luke Air Force Base. So our approach is looking at what's there right now and having a better understanding of how that could play into the airspace modeling and the flight paths moving forward. Kaufman Associates is not an airspace expert. I should say that first and foremost right up front. But we do have a team member as a part of this site selection study who is an expert in airspace. So we are relying on him to be able to give us a better understanding of how these particular sites could factor into the special air traffic rules that coexist with Luke Air Force Base. We understand that Deer Valley Airport sits, approximately 10 miles to the east, and they have a complex airspace structure with the airport traffic control tower that's in existence there. So we want to make sure we're looking at those factors as we go about the airspace and these particular sites that are being looked at. And also we want to make sure that this type of airport would be viable from the standpoint of aircraft being able to approach and departure the facility when weather conditions aren't great. I know we typically have good weather conditions out here, but poor visibility minimums, low cloud ceilings, you sometimes see that. And any aircraft operator is going to want to make sure that they can get in and out of the facility regardless of the weather conditions. So we're looking at special departure procedures. We're looking at the terrain in proximity to these particular sites and how that could impact airspace. So, and then also I don't want to discount, I mentioned earlier the incompatible land uses, residential, other sensitive noise uses. And so being able to have a better understanding of those locations in proximity to these sites, the traffic pattern, airspace, and altitudes that correspond to that, all that's being looked at as a part of this airspace component. But even coming out of the site selection study, flight paths are not going to be set in stone with this. That's something beyond this study. The Federal Aviation Administration, they have a couple lines of business. They have what they call their air traffic division. They have their flight procedures division. Those entities get involved in looking at particular sites and looking at the runway designation, runway in coordinates, and all that factors into how you would vector and route airspace and aircraft movements in relation to a particular site. So more to come on that too.
Great, thank you. So Mike, if we move forward with an Airpark, we're just not going to plop an airport down in the middle of Peoria. We're going to build the roads to connect. Part of every project that we do as city is our due diligence, making sure are the water needs met and the public infrastructure. Can you kind of walk people through that process so they know that something doesn't get built without the connectivity?
No, and thank you for that question. I think it's something we get frequently. And if you drive in Peoria, I hope you can attest to the fact that traffic in our city seems to flow better than some of the surrounding jurisdictions, and that's not on accident. The team has a master transportation and circulation plan that they look out, and roads are contemplated decades into the future and planned for 10 years into the future, and roughly a roadway alignment from concept to opening is between 3 to 5 years. So a lot of planning has already been put in place. The main arterial roadway supporting this area is Lake Pleasant Parkway. We know the minute you cross the 303 that it narrows down to a 2-lane road. And so there's already a lot of energy and effort with an initial 2010 design concept report that was published. The team is currently updating that now. And incorporated inside of that is part of our integrated water and utility master plan, which we contemplate the water distribution, wastewater reclamation lines all the way back to our treatment facilities. And so all of that's been contemplated, and the team's thinking through and starting to plan execution on that. And it's important because whether the city council elects to build an Airpark, an airport, or not, this infrastructure is still necessary. Getting water and wastewater across the 303 and all the way up to State Route 74 is key to the city's growth, and to do it wisely. Planning roadways out and building them out as early as possible, so that way development happens and congestion doesn't create before you then fix the roadway. A lot of thought has been put into this. And again, whether or not you're going to build an air park, a tech park, even if you were going to build a new park out in an area, all of these things have to be contemplated, have been contemplated, many of which have been sitting inside of the capital improvement plan for many years. And now our job as staff is to objectively look at each of these components and bring forth information to the council to make it fully informed decisions and align each of these complicated components. That's what makes this very difficult, is that you're aligning multiple strategies, multiple activities simultaneously to come up with a cohesive look and feel to the city.
So that kind of goes to our last question. What are the next steps that our residents can expect?
Yeah, and thanks for that, because that's, I think, we've talked a little bit about this internally as we prepared for this. And I think one of the key messages we want to send is, as staff, we are working really hard to be transparent in this process. We've heard people say that we're not transparent. I would argue that the level of transparency that is on the table now has led people to believe that there's some imminent decision, like an airport is going to be constructed next week. It's simply not true. There is a lot of fact-finding going on, and that fact-finding, whether it is economic development fact-finding, whether it's development fact-finding, whether it's exploration of an airport or an air park, this is all key information that council needs to make fully informed decisions. And so with that being said, I think it's important that folks know there are no imminent decisions to be made. We're here today and doing this video because the first round of economic impact studies has been completed. There will be an update provided to council, and this communication then just wraps up that communication. The second next thing we should expect to see, probably towards the end of the calendar year, is going to be that site selection. And as Matt had touched on, that site selection isn't going to be a full design of an airport with full runway delineation and a full explanation of what the air traffic control needs to look like. It's going to say, here's a place where we think it's not only feasible to build one, where it looks like you can get one in, where you could fit the look and feel. Now, should council choose to move forward, you need to go now do the deep environmental studies to make sure it's truly possible, because that's when it gets really complex. So I think in some regards we've done, being as transparent as we are, we've led folks to believe there's a decision for tomorrow. But we've made a commitment to be very transparent, and I think we have. I think we continue to make ourselves available, and as staff, that's our responsibility. We're not decision makers on whether an airport gets built or not. We simply collect facts, collect questions, answer those questions, and give that information to the decision makers, which, again, those decisions land in two ways. Number one, a land use. Number two, a budget or a development agreement.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Very robust conversation, great details and facts for our residents out there today. And to our viewers, of course, you can follow along the process online at peoriaaz.gov/Peoria Airpark. Thank you for watching.